Okay, let's start our GCC Special Issue Conference. I'm a Professor Suisheng Zhao, the editor of the Journal of Contemporary China. And also I'm a director of Center for China-US Cooperation. And this conference is hosted by the Center for China-US Cooperation at the University of Denver. In fact, when we started planning for the conference and also for the papers, we had Nanjing University, Johns Hopkins China Center, Johns Hopkins Nanjing University, Center for U.S.-China Culture, and to join this, join host the conference. However, the leading person in Nanjing University and Johns Hopkins Center director, he was promoted to a bigger job at the university level. So he can no longer be a host. So he asked Professor Wang Senhu from National University of Singapore to help coordinate the authors. And so the conference itself is as planned to have all the 4 papers, just Nanjing University and Johns Hopkins University coordination and collaboration is changed. And the topic of the conference is distant reading China using big data. The point when I talked to the guest editor, Chen, Professor Chen, he told me that because at this time, the data, the privacy issue in China is not as strict as in the US. The big data is very easy to connect and be used. So that's why he had this, Yun Song, I mean, Professor Chen Yun Song, had this idea to use big data to understand China's certain issues, especially from the cultural perspective. So that's how this topic has come up. And we have 4 papers to be presented. And each paper presenter will have about 15 minutes to make presentation. And each paper will have a discussant to make what I call constructive criticism, try to be as critical as possible. In that way, we could help improve these papers. And each discussant will have about 10 minutes to make their points. Then we'll open up the floor for comments from the audience and also from other paper presenters and discussants to each other. So this is the procedure, the logistic of the paper. And we have our China Center's work study students, 3 excellent students helping us to logistics. If you have any problems, you can talk to them. Jessica Gu, Eduardo, Maya, and Xia Shuangqi, 1 student from Taiwan, 1 student from China, and 1 student from America. So it's good. Today is a very good composition. Without further ado, let's start the first paper presentation. The topic is International Cinema's Shifting Portrayals of China, and topics, emotions, and the determinants. There are quite few authors of the paper. It's a major collaboration project. I think for those big data issues, really, they need quite a few authors as a team. And the presenter is a Professor Ma Wenma at Department of Sociology, Nanjing University. So Ma Wen, you have 15 minutes.
Okay, thank you, Professor Zhao. Can everyone hear me?
Yes, we can hear you well.
Okay, I will share my presentation now. So I will start my presentation. And I'm Wema, and I'm now a PhD candidate at Nanjing University, and it is my honor to have the chance today to present our article. And the topic that I will present is International Cinema's Shifting Portrayals of China, Topics, Emotions, and Determinants. And in this article, we applied machine learning methods, specifically the word embedding technology, Lda Topic Model, and emotion analysis to study China's image in international cinema throughout the 20th and 21st centuries. And there are 4 parts of my presentation. And the first part is the background. I will introduce the concept of national image and changes of China's image in Hollywood films. According to Kenneth Boulding, a country's national image is built on a combination of a country's self-cognition and other bodies' cognition of it. It can sometimes a distortion of the facts. He expressed this concept at the level of the international system. And according to George Hegel, who emphasized the idealistic meaning of the topic, of the concept, image is the sensuous existence of a particular significance. Then we can see that though image is based on reality, it has subjective elements. As for film, if we want to study the portrayals of a country's image in films, we also need to know its features. Since films can communicate more directly between the subject and the audience, it is more straightforward than other forms of arts. Through artificial process, film can both manufacture images of the world and reflect reality. Then we go to the general history of the films related to China. Since Hollywood greatly represents the world's film industry, we mainly look at representative Hollywood films. In 1920s, films like The Mysterious Dr. Fu Manchu had tenebrous themes coupled with evil characters like Fu Manchu, or told of the yellow pearl in the Western world. During World War II, like the film The Good Earth showed China's uncivilized status and garnered the sympathy of Western audience. The 1960s saw films of anti-communist topics, and the later films saw the popularity of Kung Fu films starring Bruce Lee. When entering the 21st century, as China is getting stronger, films like Kung Fu Panda began to highlight China's cultural and economic power. And we may ask that why such changes happened. We all know films are invented in the West and introduced to the East. So they have those kind of colonialism, and for China, it's Orientalism. In the late 19th century, when film appeared, China had become a semi-colony and an Oriental fantasy of powerful Western countries. And according to Edward Said's theory for Orientalism, the remote and strange Oriental world in the Western artwork is artificially created to manifest cultural superiority of the West. The international media system, including international cinema, is shaped by idealism, so the films are mainly under an ideological shadow. Also, Orientalism affects the way the East sees itself. In China, Orientalism exists. A better term would be Reorientalism. There are a lot of films made in China have it, like Hero made by Zhang Yimou in 2002. These films are very close to Hollywood style. Chinese filmmakers wanted to achieve international reputation, so they tell Chinese culture based on Western perspective. And because of this, and because the number of films made in China in our sample is relatively small, we can largely regard these films of China as formulated according to an outsider's perspective, especially the view of the West. And the second part is the method we used to study image in films. About the database, we choose Internet Movie Database, IMDb. the world's most popular and authoritative film source. And the right picture is what IMDb has. We selected films before 2020 with China and Chinese as keywords and got a total of 4,428 China-related films. We use web crawler technology to grab film titles and pilots. One thing I need to mention is the editor of IMDb decide which film should be included in the database. Western perspectives might bias the editors against China, affecting their choice of China-related films. In this case, audience may be influenced to accept what the image of China should be, rather than what it actually is. What we want to know is what China should look like and how these images are formed. And then text analysis based on unsupervised machine learning and natural language process technologies can make us further to see the text. And to measure the main situation setting of China and Chinese people, we apply the word-to-vector model to predict the contextual information of China and Chinese, and to discover how portrayals of China differ around the world. We use Lda topic mining to see the topics of China-related films. We further adopt emotion analysis to calculate the general emotion tone of relative films and measure the overall attitudes towards China in various regions. And the second part is the results of our analysis. About the number of China-related films around the world, we can see from the figure that it continues to increase during about 100 years. It was affected by China's international influence and major international events. For instance, in 1970s, the People's Republic of China returned to the United Nations and established diplomatic relations with Japan, the United States, and European countries. Such opening up, together with the rapid economic development and commercialization of the film industry in Taiwan and Hong Kong, probably make the peaks appear. And in the new century, the surging national strength of the PRC made the number of China-related films soar. We use the CBOW and skip-gram to train word vector models. This table showed words with the shortest cosine distance to the center word, China and Chinese. And we can divide these words into 4 groups. First, descriptive words show the impression of China in international films. China is ancient, modern, polite, or communist, having both traditional and modern features. Second, culture and social issues that China-related films mainly focus on. They were important and associated with widespread social phenomena, including culture, religion, immigration, revolution, and economy. The third group was place names, and the fourth group involved sensitive issues like refugee, famine, colony, and exile. Then we predict specific context by adding some keywords to the word China, and the left table is places and the right is historical figures or groups. And so we mainly just focus on the historical figures, and we choose some very important figures such as Mao Zedong, Chiang Kai-shek, communists, Tibetan, and Japanese people. The words close to Mao were dynasty, emperor, communists, and revolution. China-related films mainly regard him as the head of state in the new period of China history and take the long historical view of him. Words related to Chiang include war, evasion, and 1937, which is the start of resistance against Japanese aggression, and he served as commander-in-chief of this war. As for communists, words such as persecution and refugee frequently appeared, which probably showing a very critical attitude, and communists actually had a very negative image in international films. Then we go to the topic models. We use the Lda Topic Model to cluster all the pilot summary tests and got 10 topics. The topic coherence indicator helped us decide the number of topics, and here are the 10 topics. Based on them, we further selected 7 important topics, and they accounted for 90% of the contents. We also drew their trends to see the diachronic change. The largest topic was daily life, accounting for 40%, including words like young, family, America, and Hong Kong. It indicated that Chinese people's daily lives now have more international factors. And the kinship and friendship topic was the second largest topic, have words like father, friend, child, mother, and son. Similarly, love accounted for 7%, and the words close to it were the subjects of love, such as family, friend, woman, and wife. Finally, culture had 10%, and the words related to it reflected the image of China with a very long history, profound culture traditions, and a varied natural landscape. We can see that the 4 topics all increased during the past 50 years. Crime also had very high proportion, 16%. Most related words are very violent, such as kill, gun, fight, fire, murder, and drug. Films involving this topic had violent situations and described China as a country with a chaotic social order and high crime rate. War accounted for 6% of the total. It mainly involves royalty power and modern wars like World War II. The rate of the above 3 topics decreased since the 1970s, and it coincided with China's economic reform, the opening up, and peaceful development policy. China has developed economy, improved social governance, and increased foreign exchanges. That's why Western countries reduced the number of crime-related films, and China's image has changed from the violent one to the tender and cultured one. And finally is the emotion. We use Google's Cloud Natural Language platform to calculate the emotion score of the China-related tests and drew the trend line. The negative score means negative emotion, otherwise it's positive emotion. We have identified the features of the emotion scores. First, it reflected changes in China's comprehensive strength and global status. The emotion scores greatly rose with fluctuations. And second, the peaks and valleys during specific periods were related to significant events. For example, the peak of 1953 to 1959 was due to the funding of the PRC and the large-scale industrialization program. And then, since the Great Leap Forward and People's Commune movement, the score dropped quickly. In the 1970s, the friendly interactions between the PRC and the world, especially the United States, create a new peak. However, in the 1990s, mainly because of the Tiananmen Square incident in 1989, the emotion score dropped sharply around 1992. And thirdly, ideological factors caused contrasts between emotion scores and social reality. In films like Broken Blossoms and The Good Earth, Chinese people were poor and weak. Such stereotypes inspired the American missionary spirit of salvation, and some scholars even believed the movie The Good Earth won a more favorable Far Eastern policy for China from the US government during World War II. Ideological influences were also evident in the 1960s and 1990s. In the 1960s, the American Red Scare against the Communist Party spread all over the world, making China's image evil. And after 1989, the international community began to question the PRC's human rights conditions and the evaluation of China became extremely negative. It did not conform to China's prosperous society at that time. Considering China's image may differ in various regions, we further analyzed China-related films in the US, Russia, and Japan. Here are the figures of the US and Japan. And these figures reflect their film numbers and emotion scores. We can see from the US score feature that the trend of film emotion score and number was roughly the same as that of the whole world. It had over 2,000 films, proving that the US always has the most influential China-related films and dominates global trends. And for Japan, its film number was relatively small, 125. The value of the emotion score in the 1960s were probably because of fearing the PRC's military strength and did not recover until the PRC and Japan established diplomatic relations in 1972. And after 2010, the two countries have maintained frequent economic and cultural exchanges, causing the new peak. The above is the main contents of our paper. We concluded that the image of China in international films can be divided into 5 stages. Before World War II, China had an evil and barbaric image due to yellow pearl and deep-rooted Orientalism. And during World War II, filmmakers began to show the suffering of Easterners and the selflessness of Westerners. And from 1945 to 1975, fears of the Communist Party made China a scheme entity that wanted to rule the world. After 1975, because of the PRC's renewal of the open door policy and the boom of Taiwan and Hong Kong, the international community has turned the spotlight on common people's lives. Since the beginning of the 21st century, China is taking off and winning a more open, inclusive, and positive image. However, it does not entirely account with reality. And the cinematic image of China is produced when politics interact with ideology. This image is a complex system of influential factors, including national strength, interests, status, and diplomacy. And the quantitative analysis can also verify the propositions of culture theory. Orientalist fantasies were especially evident before 1975, though it declines now, but still exists, like Disney's film Mulan in 2020. Its core concept of being royal, brave, and true is pieced together from Confucian classicals, while the Chinese actually seldom put these 3 words together, and it is more like the spirit of the West than the belief of the Chinese themselves. Such works will collide with nationalist films exported from China. And also, although we do not know the outcome, it is true that Western filmmakers will not ignore Chinese audience views, since China has the world's 2nd largest film market, and this point was extremely vital during the COVID-19 epidemic. And that is all my presentation. Thank you very much for listening.
You're muted.
Okay, thank you for the very interesting presentation. And are the other authors of the paper here with you today?
Yeah.
Okay, good. I hope they are all here because they should also listen to the comments from the discussant so you can revise the paper together. I think that you have quite a few authors here.
Yeah.
Sun Wen is here? No?
Yes, I'm here.
Oh, good. Nice to hear you. And Wright Davis from Hong Kong University, Science Technology, and Chen Zun and Yun Song. Hi.
Yes, Chen Zhuo is here, I think.
Chen Zhuo is here. Okay, good.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's good. Discussant for this paper is Professor Tianqi Cai from Department of Sociology at Macau University. Okay, Professor Cai.
Hey, thank you for the opportunity. Because I heard from the editor, so I can be as critical as possible. So I think I will let it go. So the major concern for me for this paper, actually, this has been shared with other manuscripts in the computational field, is that the theoretical framing is relatively weak, which is related to the method or the analytical strategy and the interpretation of the results. So, for example, the authors mentioned that the change of the image or the in U.S. movies probably due to several reasons, but the only reason they focus on actually is the change of China. But they ignored the possibility that the change of the image, how the China being portrayed or Chinese being portrayed in the movie actually also could be driven by domestic politics in the US. Say, for example, party changes, presidency changes, such and such, and also the market. See, for example, one movie might be very successful in market and then maybe just promote or spark another movie just follow. So in that case, say the interpretation of the results only focus on the change of China, how China changes the booming economy such and such might not be the major reason why the image changes. Well, the image changes. That's my major concern. Maybe authors might want to spend more time focus on the relationship between China and the US, and then from different angle to interpret the results. So say, for example, after China joined WTO, and then it's required to import several movies, and then become the second largest US movies in the world. So many of the plots or the movies, how they portray China might be influenced by this kind of market kind of consideration. So the plots might change. So instead of focus on how China changed, maybe folks should be switch on or pay attention to at least on the relationship between China and the US. So that's my major concern. Well, the second one is related to the framing is an analytical strategy. So it seems like now it's more like a descriptive. See, you run a model, you run some topic models, and then you got the results, you plot it, and then say, okay, that's because of what? And then since there is no competing hypothesis in the in the paper, so the interpretation is just one way. For example, as I mentioned, so after joining WTO, plots may change, the topic models might change, keywords might change, such and such. So that's my second concern. So one more thing related to the methods or the database they're choosing. The database they're choosing actually contains so many different generics. For example, there are documentary movie and also commercial movie. So you're running models only for together might not just show the differences in terms of the focus for the different generic movie. So documentary might focus completely different compared to the commercial. So maybe you can run the model separately, for example, by the generics. So that might give you some different ideas. The third one, another one, say the plots or the storyline written by in a database actually is submitted by users, volunteers. So it's not by review. Well, some of them being reviewed, but for these frequently contributors, they can just let it go. So for the storyline, for commercial movie, the storyline, the way they write the storyline might be different, completely different compared to the documentary movie. So again, you might want to just instead of focusing on the plot, well, maybe focus on the actor or actress, how they play the movie. maybe just show you a very different story. And then another one. So why you choose this database? Yes, it is big enough, but as a sensitive check or robustness check, maybe Rotten Tomatoes can be your second evidence. So that might be the case. I think that's all. I think I said enough. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Professor Cai. I think his comments are right to the point. I did not notice his education background in the U.S., in the Chapel Hill and North Texas data method analysis. So you are in a very good position to make these constructive and critical comments. In fact, I agree with his comments very much. For me, this paper has used a very sophisticated methodology using those film data, try to use computer learning, all those methodology to tell the image of China in the Western society using the films. But for me, as Professor Cai raised the question, using all the technology, what new knowledge you tell us? And what are here, basically you described the change image of China as a positive, negative, this kind of simple typology. And you even did not tell us what are the conventional wisdoms you are arguing against. In other words, why you do the research? I mean, for those negative, positive, and also driven by China's changes, those are common knowledge, common sense. Why you spend so much time and resources tell us this common sense result? You have to justify that. So what are the conventional wisdoms that your research, your findings have challenged? So that's what I don't see from this research. And also, there are so many survey research. What is this type of big data analysis different from those survey research? I mean, China image, there's so many different ways to do that research. The most prevailing way so far have been survey. So why you have a different approach? Why use a different approach? How the different approach will tell us a different result? So those are the very basic questions anyone read your article would ask. And really, I don't see clearly an analytical argument. You made mostly descriptive, although you try to establish the causal relationship between the image changes and also China's changes. But as Professor Cai mentioned, there are a variety of variables, including the filmmakers' countries, domestic politics, different consumer market, all variety of factors other than the China's internal changes could influence the film's image of China. So you don't have to get into those variables, but you have to tell us why. So for me, reading this article, the critical issue for me is what I can learn from this, why I read this article. And from author's perspective, your perspective, you also have to have a clear idea who are the audience. Those are people in the film industry, or those are China scholars, or general public. So who are those people you are writing to? And what are the arguments, the most important arguments I mean, when I said argument, is new knowledge you are presenting. So these are the critical issues. I don't find clear answer in the paper, which I don't want to exaggerate the negative parts of the paper. The paper research is very solid and the subject itself is important, but you just have to tell us why you do the research and what are new knowledge you are generating from this research. Those are the critical issues I have. Okay, so now the floor is open. Anyone could jump in to make comments or criticism or ask questions.
I'll ask a question.
Okay, Jessica.
Yeah,
She was our student before. Now, where are you now?
I'm in Colorado, so I'm a DU alum and still located in Colorado, working for the Society of Asian Scientists and Engineers as a program manager.
Nice to see you.
So yeah, very well presented. I agree with the comments I already mentioned. I just had a quick question about the topic slide with the 7 topics that you selected. It might be very basic and that you might have answered it, but I see the boxes around where you chose that. How did you choose the placement in the graph?
So you mean how I choose the topic, the 7 topics from the 10?
Not the 7 topics, but those boxes, like the red boxes and the blue boxes. Where did you pick those? How did you decide to have the red boxes over towards the right side? Maybe I can't see the graph.
Actually, I just pick it just randomly.
Okay, so you just picked a selection of time in there.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, I see one post in the chat that said the sophisticated methods, but how do you process the keywords? That's a very technical question.
Well, actually, I can just because I do not make the model, because and other authors made the model, so I can just explain it generally, and I actually just put these keywords, and we see keywords China and Chinese to search it in the text we grabbed, and we use the grabbed from the website and the pilots and the titles of the movies, and then we just to search for the keywords in those tests and do the model.
Who did the model among your authors?
Chen Zhuo.
Can you answer that, Chen Zhuo? You are here?
Yeah, she's here. She's here.
Yes, I'm here.
Can we see your face? Hi.
Yes, hi, I'm here.
So you can answer that question? How you establish your models? How do you select those keywords, process those keywords?
I think I select this keyword according to the what-to vector model, and I first choose China and Chinese to do some analyze, and then I found another word like cultural and something. All these words are very related to the word of China or Chinese, and then I select this word.
So yeah, as I said, it's you know, like it's very, very interesting. I understand in the analysis of cultural products like films and literature pieces and everything, quantitative methods are used and very important trends are found. So that is why I was asking this question. You know, I'm getting into this area, so so I'm trying to understand the area clearly. So basically, you have chosen all the movies made by Chinese directors, right? Or about China
Yes,
in the US.
yes,
All the Chinese directors, I thought all the
No. Actually, we just selected the movies related to
China.
China. They are made in different regions, such as United States, Japan, and China.
Right.
A lot of regions.
Right, and then you use the text in English, right? So,
Yeah.
so maybe the movie is in Japanese, English, Chinese, or whatever, but you use English text to do the searching, to you know to find the keywords. So my question here is, for example, like you mentioned Orientalism, right? And so, so which keywords would be indicating to you that this is Orientalism? Do you have to? I mean, I guess it's a huge data set, you know. So I try to understand how this is, you know, and also because when people talk, and there's the issue of you have to read some texts, maybe like sentences containing this keyword, like, you know, like yellow peril, for example, right? And so that's a very clear indicator that this is Orientalism. So I just wonder, you know, I am impressed that you have this connection between Orientalism and this sophisticated method used.
Okay, I just to use the theory of Orientalism to explain my results from the models, and because if I just add the keywords such as Orientalism in the movie, in the test, you couldn't get some very useful results.
Nobody
Since,
would
since the movies will not just say Orientalism or something in their tests. So I just to use the theory to explain the results, because the results is very simple, and I need to have a theory, have a very strong theory to just explain it, to just show it to the audience. Yeah.
I don't think the findings are the results are simple.
Okay, let's move on. The methodology is important, but the more important are contents for me.
I do agree. You know, I mean, you've given a lot of important feedback, but I am impressed. Thank you.
Okay, so any more questions? People are shy. And now, can you answer the questions raised by the commentator and myself, any of the authors?
To answer the question, to answer the feedback.
Yeah, the questions from Professor Cai and myself.
Okay, I think thank you for your very critical comments. And I, when I just write this article, I also find the point of this about the aim of our article and about the methods we used and the theory or something. And I think Professor Cai's comments it's very meaningful to me, and to use the international relationships between the United States and China to explain the results of our model. And I do not explain it well in my article is because of the length. Its length is not enough, and so I just explain it simply, and because I need to share more share more space for the models and the results and to how to explain them in my article. So I just to ignore those kind of international relationship things and the factors from the internal United States. And maybe in the further research, we were just focus on the Hollywood films or focus on films in one region or something. And maybe I think now we just want to show a panorama of the Western audience see about the China-related films, and we think that the just showing of the panorama is also very important. And maybe in the future we will just do some do some other research on the results and tell some more vital and critical new knowledge. Thank you.
Okay, how about my question? What are the new knowledge you generated? I mean, you said the China rise would produce the first positive. Why not negative? So all those kind of hypotheses, those kind of cultural relationships, you really have not established clearly, at least to me. How do you answer those questions? And
I think that for me, and I have the position that the Chinese image should be positive, and I'm a Chinese. I'm from China, and I think everyone when they write the articles, they will have the propositions that the Chinese image should be positive or negative. But I really find that in the results of the models, they are not totally positive or something. So I just point out this in my article. And for the new knowledge, I think that first our methodology is the new knowledge, the new methods to study those kind of tests. And I think that if we do the qualitative analyze or something, and maybe this is not, we can not explain all the movies. And if we use a big data and use the machine learning methods, and we can to see the panorama more, to see the panorama more. I do not know how to explain it, but I think that the methods is a key point, and we just want to do just a whole review of the Chinese movies, and maybe in the further research we will do some focus works and do some more models and to use the models we use now.
Let me respond to your answers. I'm not convinced by what your answers. First of all, you said that as a Chinese, you want the Chinese image to be positive, which I understand is a natural. But as a scholar, you study what it is, not what should be. What should be
actually, actually, I just want to study what it should be and how.
No, that's not. Then we will not publish the article. This is not for the academic world. What should be is not a scholarly research.
I think that is really interesting for me, and
okay.
maybe
then you are learning
just,
from China.
and maybe I just I want one thing I need to mention that maybe in my article I do not show any perspectives of me and do not show my point, but maybe in my presentation I just show something of my attitude to this kind of image.
Okay. Second, methodology you said is new indeed, but our journal is not a methodology journal. We are China area study journal. So methodology is important, but not the the most important part for us to publish your article. If it's mostly a sophisticated methodology, you should publish that in the methodology journal, not our journal. So these are the two issues of this article, which I think are very critical. And the authors have to take them into very serious consideration in order for it to be eventually published. Otherwise, I will not publish that for sure. Okay, so let's move on to the second article by Professor Sun Hu Wang, Department of Sociology at the National University of Singapore. The topic of the paper is searching for the rainbow connections, regional development, and public interest in LGBT in China. This should be a very sensitive, interesting topic. Professor Wang.
Okay, thank you. So let me share the screen. Okay, so it's my great honor to have this opportunity to make the presentation. And this is the collaborative work with Zhang Boyang, Yong Yuhan, and He Guangye from Nanjing University, and Yan Fei from Tsinghua University. So let me first talk about some background about the LGBT. So LGBT generally refers to lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender. So with the increasing gender equality, and so homosexuality has been legalized in China in 1997. However, and also according to an official report in 2016, there are about 70 million LGBT individuals, and also more than 100 LGBT-related organizations in China to deal with LGBT issues. However, LGBT is still a very sensitive and heavily stigmatized topic, phenomena in China. And for example, the United Nations Development Program has estimated that in China, only 5% of LGBT individuals have revealed their sexual orientation. So, the question is that why is LGBT a highly stigmatized issue in China? So this is related to the Chinese Confucian family culture, because the culture emphasizes the importance of marriage and having children in order to continue the family lineage. So they still think that marriage and having children are two very important stages in one's life. Therefore, there is a very strong social desirability pressure, which poses a lot of challenges to measure LGBT-related issue in real life, because people feel pressure from the society, and people, so then people are reluctant to reveal their own sexual orientation or homosexual behaviors. So, but with the rise of internet, it provides LGBT people an anonymous platform to seek relations and discuss relevant LGBT issues, and they don't need to worry about this kind of social pressure. So, so this is the general background. And in previous research, so the most previous research on LGBT issues were conducted in Western countries and using survey methods. But as I mentioned, one important and one crucial issue with the survey method is that there is this, and so there are some social desirability bias in the first place, and secondly, previous research tends to focus on, for example, the health, labor market inequality of LGBT population. They also focus on patterns of same marriage or discrimination against LGBT issues Yeah, so this is all about previous research. So here I identify two important research gaps. So the one important research gap, as I mentioned, is that using survey to measure LGBT-related issue, such as people's sexual behavior and people's interest in certain sexual behavior, leads to strong social desirability bias, especially in China, where the family culture is very strong. So, for example, in survey, although we can use some methods to guarantee anonymity, but there's still a huge concern that anonymity cannot be fully guaranteed. So therefore, in the survey, people are reluctant to reveal their sexual orientation or interest in the sexual behavior. And so therefore, the prevalence of LGBT and its related issue of behavioral interest are heavily underestimated. So the second research gap from previous literature is that previous research, they tend to focus on the individual level determinants of LGBT or homosexual issues, such individual level health or labor market outcome and so on. But previous research haven't paid much attention to the macro level socioeconomic determinants of public interest in LGBT. Yeah. So after talking about two research gaps, so let me talk about the two research contributions of this work. So the first contribution is that in order to address the research gap, in other words, the social desirability bias associated with survey, we use the query volumes of LGBT-related keywords in Baidu. So this is an important source of big data to proxy, so the aggregate level of public interest in LGBT issues from 2009 to 2015. So it is important to know that although so the two ways to measure LGBT are not directly comparable, but I think our approach provides a new way to understand the public interest in LGBT, and which can be a very good complement to the traditional survey methods to measure LGBT interest or behavior. So secondly, in order to address the second research gap, we matched province level data to LGBT search data to explore to what extent the public interest in LGBT is determined and shaped by macro level. In our case, it's province level, political, cultural, and socioeconomic factors. This is also very important in sociology, and because in sociology, there's widely held assumption that people's behavior, attitudes, and intention are shaped by structural and political, cultural factors. Yeah. So yeah. So then let me talk about the method. So firstly, I would like to talk about the data and the measures. So when we're talking about, we will use Baidu search data. So this is primarily because Baidu is the largest search engine in China and account for 95% of all, in other words, 95% of all Chinese population tend to use Baidu as the primary search engine. Also, the search data has another advantage, is that compared with social media, big data, so which are usually subject to government regulations in China. So the search data is relatively less regulated. In other words, so we can have a more comprehensive understanding and a measure of public interest in LGBT. So let me briefly talk about Baidu Index. Baidu Index is very similar to Google Index. It provides data to measure the annual query volume of each LGBT-related keyword. Yeah. So we use principal component factor analysis to derive one factor score to measure so the LGBT interest. So here, in total, we have 118 LGBT related keywords. We derived this keyword, all of these keywords from LGBT community. So in the community, there are a lot of LGBT related materials. So here I only show some of them. And we use the Baidu search index based on Chinese keywords, mostly Chinese keywords. And here we also provide some translations. So then, then we use principal component analysis to derive one LGBT interest index. So this is our key dependent variable. So then our independent variable are province level socioeconomic characteristics. We derived this data from National Bureau of Statistics of China. So these include so the log GDP per capita, log income of urban residents. Here we focus on urban residents because so the urban residents are generally more likely to be interested in LGBT or involved in these behaviors. And so the first two variables are used to measure so the economic development of a province. We also have the logged number of population, a logged number of universities in province. This is also very important because the young people in a university are generally more likely to be involved in such homosexual behavior. And we also have a logged number of libraries, museums, and art galleries. So the number of university and the number of libraries, museums, and art galleries are used to measure cultural development. And we also have a number of NGOs. This is also very important because a lot of NGOs are funded to deal with social issues like LGBT. And finally, we have the logged provincial income from international tourism. This variable aims to measure the level of international openness. This is also very important because as I mentioned in China, so the gender tradition, so the gender culture and family culture are relatively very traditional. So therefore, province with more international tourism are more likely to be influenced by the Western culture and a Western sexual ideology and relations. So basically our hypothesis is that sort of province with higher level of economic development, higher level of cultural development, and higher level of international openness are more likely to show higher public interest in LGBT. So so in terms of analytic strategy, because our data are the panel data from 2009 to 2015 at the province level, so we use dynamic panel model to examine the dynamic relations between province level socioeconomic development and public interest in LGBT. So the dynamic model enables us to introduce a lag value of LGBT search index in order to take into account the past dependency of people's search behavior. So so here is the brief equation of a model. So the dependent variable is LGBT search index. So here we include the lag value of LGBT search index. And then we include various province level socioeconomic characteristics. We also include here. We also control the time as in order to take into account the period effects. Then these are the average. So we estimated the dynamic model by starting with the simple put OIS, then fixed facts models with a lagged term. Then we use a more sophisticated method. So because if we introduce the lagged term of search index, so these will lead to a dynamic panel bias. So they will lead to some endogeneity issues. So then we use more complicated methods. So the difference GMM and also the system GMM, and so the difference GMM and the system GMM, they use relevant lag dependent variable and independent variable as instruments to solve the endogeneity problems. And so we conducted this number of robustness checks such as unit root test and A/B test and the Hansi-Sargan test, and basically the analysis passed all these checks and shows that so the GMM estimated to analyze the dynamic model are robust. So yeah, so firstly, let me show some descriptive analysis. So this is a descriptive analysis for each province from 2009 to 2015. We find that so the LGBT search was gradually increased and peaked in around 2012 and then slightly decreased. And basically, and however, it is important to note that even we find a slight decrease after 2012, but it doesn't necessarily mean there's decline of public interest, because it is possible that people already find the information needed and they then simply stop searching. Yeah. And we also find an important pattern that so the increasing pattern are particularly strong in the more social and economically developed areas. So this is also consistent to our hypothesis. And yeah, so let me show a more. So in this graph, we can find some regional differences in the LGBT search behavior. Yeah. Here we find is so here the pattern is very clear, and we find that so the LGBT search, or the public interest in LGBT is more pronounced in, for example, Beijing, Tianjin, Shandong, Jiangsu, Zhejiang, Shanghai, Guangdong. So these all are the coastal areas and highly economically developed, also with greater openness to international tourism. Yeah. And in contrast, so the LGBT search are relatively low in the western areas such as Xinjiang, Tibet, Qinghai, Gansu, Ningxia. Yeah, so these are the regions and who are relatively less economically developed and also with relatively lower cultural development and international openness. So so then we move on the formal statistical model. In a formal model, as I said, we start with simple put OLS, then simple fixed facts model with the lagged term, and then we move on the more sophisticated difference GMM and system GMM. Yeah. So I think the general pattern is very clear, and we find that. For example, if a province with more with higher level of log income and higher level of cultural development and higher level of international tourism, and also larger number of population, and also more social development. Yeah, so that is more NGOs tend to show stronger interest in LGBT. Yeah, so there are two coefficients are not significant. One is log the GDP per capita, and another is a log education. So log education means the number of universities. I think the I think the log GDP per capita maybe is not as accurate as log income to measure people's real economic ability. And also the number of universities are not significant. I think this is partly because so the number of universities do not change over time too much, and because our model is from 2009 to 2015, and so the number of university funded do not change too much. So, but basically, these results are consistent with our hypothesis. So let me briefly discuss the findings. I think first of all, this study presents the large-scale longitudinal portrait of a growing public interest in LGBT issues, using for the first time using the Baidu search data and also the dynamic panel model. And secondly, we find strong evidence that provinces with higher level of economic, cultural, social development, as well as international openness, show more public interest in LGBT. Yeah, so this finding raises some important issue for the policy, and in terms of how to measure LGBT, in terms of, for example, some policy to support LGBT or to tackle LGBT-related issues such as homosexual sex, homosexual health, or the same-sex marriage issue. So I hope this presentation can serve as the start point for further research using big data to further explore the LGBT-related issues. And there are some limitations, and which can be the potential focus of the future research. And first of all, although we have tried our best to collect as many as LGBT-related keywords as possible, but we're still not sure whether the list can exhaust all possible LGBT-related terms. Secondly, our sample might be limited to the internet users. But maybe this is not a very serious problem, because many young generations, they are very frequent international users. And finally, our research is conducted at the macro level and cannot be easily generalized to any level. Okay, so this is all my research and all my presentations. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you for the presentation. Now the discussant is Professor Qiu Shifeng from Department of Sociology at the National University of Singapore.
Thank you, Professor Zhao. You can hear me clearly, right?
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. Okay, it's my pleasure to participate into this event, and very happy to review Senhu's paper. Firstly, I acknowledge I am not in the field of either the gender study or the computational social science, although I did a little bit. But I think I would like to review in line with Tianji's way, try to be more critical. Firstly, I have to say that the topic is important. I think most of the findings are reasonable in the sense that we could understand. And also, I think the method has been used in a robust manner. The paper itself, even in a descriptive manner, I think it's valuable for the audience to understand what's going on in China in regard to the dynamics of LGBT. Let me first raise a very minor issue. I don't think Chinese law has allowed same-sex marriage so far. So, when you say homosexuality has been legalized in 1997, I was trying to double confirm this in different resources. I find the Chinese marriage law did not change. Yeah, so please double confirm this basic fact. Number two, I think I want to be more substantial. I totally agree with you that there is a lot of gaps in this field. I think mostly because of the newness of the topic, but mostly because of the data limitation. And that's how computational social science will have a role to play here. But I think theoretically, there's a big space to further explore. Is definitely less very rarely studied to explore the macro level dynamics or disparity. But in terms of dynamics, I think in the current paper, the baseline theory has been presented in a quite simple manner. Let me just briefly describe it. Namely, with economic development, we can assume that people became more open-minded in regard to LGBT. And therefore, we expect to see the better economically developed region will have a more open mind in regard to LGBT, manifested by the online query volume. And that is generally the hypothesis. Well, within this scenario, there's definitely a assumption about modernization and westernization. I mean, this is the baseline logic of developmental studies. Namely, when modernization happened, everyone was supposed to be more like Westerners. Okay? And this kind of logic also applied to the recent debate on globalization. Well, I'm not against this, but I would like to say this is really problematic because globally speaking, economic development is not necessarily end up with westernization. Look at Islamic world. I mean, this kind of also specifically regard to LGBT development in the economy may not necessarily lead to open-minded in a Western manner. So that's if this is the case, I'd like to see a different perspective to understand LGBT in the West. We know that some scholars do believe there's a rise or more legitimacy of LGBT in the Western society. But there's also other group of thoughts think that it's not the LGBT is launching a sexual revolution, but more of it kind of stir a new round of debate, making the society have a more dichotomous view in regard to LGBT. On the one side, you see the organization of LGBT movement, but on the other side, the anti-LGBT movement is equally strong in the Western society. I'm not an expert to this, but let me say, does Chinese, some fundamental issues, does Chinese stigmatize LGBT in the Western manner? And is Chinese supposed to be just like Westerners to perceive LGBT? I mean, Confucianism, culturally speaking, does have the anti-LGBT element, but it's very different from the Christianity-based stigmatization. And LGBT actually, I mean, same-sex, culture, sometimes in Chinese history has been part of the, formal culture. Okay, so I'm trying to say from the Chinese perspective, we're not supposed to stigmatize LGBT in the Western way. To make it more complicated, socialism and LGBT. How socialism is particularly against LGBT. That's another issue you may have to think theoretically. So when I talk about these issues, I'm trying to suggest in the theoretical part of it, probably you may have more sophisticated argumentation and even some kind of alternative hypothesis. Okay. Okay, this is the theoretical part. I want to say about the method part. I mean, in regard to the modeling, I really like the way that I thought like in this kind of research, a basic fixed effect model will be fairly enough. I'm happy to see you use SGMM and also put them together. Although, as Professor Zhao said, the journal might not be methodological oriented, but I like this kind of very robust testing. But I would suggest to you to link your key independent variable more closely to your concept. It looks like you say like I'm going to measure economic development, and therefore GDP, income, all related variables are put in. Actually, ideally, you may have one human economic development index applied to all the province. That will make the story more robust. Instead of trying several independent variables there as a cluster without strong justifications. Okay, that's my first criticism. But I think my major criticism is that for the control, I see your control for population, which is very right. Look at your figure 1. Beijing is, averagely speaking, Beijing, Shanghai, Tianjin, those metropolitan area. If your theory is right, these curves should be way above the others because there's no rural area, right? Because the mechanism is economic development translate to culture, and culture translate to openness. Then the metropolitan cities might stand up. But Beijing is not at the top because Beijing is not the most populous. And that means there's a second mechanism, namely how people are netizens. Only control population might not be enough. Not only that, I also suggest you to control for the total internet access of the province, also the total ownership of the cell phone mobiles. Because the rise you observe is very much likely driven by the more accessibility of the infrastructure instead of people become more open-minded. Without control these, the story might not be solid enough. And then more specifically, I think your figure 1 need to be population standardized. That's more specific. Okay, then let's move to the dependent variable. I think the finding are extremely interesting. I'm very curious about the SGMM model. At that, you very wisely put year there as to see, the year, taking, I think 1999 as the reference, and then see the other years. They're all negative. They're all negative. And then I see some explanations of you in the paper, but how come when after you talk about the major economic stories, the year variable all become negative? Namely, the openness actually dropped down according to your story in reference to the 1999. So that might be something there. I hope to have more explorations. On the other hand, the rise of query may because of openness, may open because of contentiousness, may also because of debate, may also because of discrimination or stigmatization, or only because of curiosity. It's not necessarily the more acceptance as you make the argument. You need to be conservative here, because really the dependent variable does not directly indicate acceptance. Okay, lastly, I think if I do the paper, I'm thinking about, I think the most important part is the fully developed list of, I think you have 118 words as the list. That's super interesting. For some words, I never heard of it. I mean, because maybe I'm too old, I don't know. But look at the words. I see the word, I can understand. That means there might be a cohort hierarchy in these words. So probably if you could classify these words in a meaningful way, your research could help to answer for this more acceptance of LGBT. Is it because of the new cohort inflow or because of the old generation changing their minds? I think there's a potential there to see this. And I also think this is an interesting question about how modernization, or we call it westernization, is happening in China in the complicated manner. That will be helpful for the literature, I believe. Okay, thank you very much, Professor Zhao. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Professor Feng, for such a, insightful and constructive and critical comments. I think your comments are right to the point of the paper. Let me add a few points as a moderator here. The dependent variable we talk about, you talk about the public interest using the Baidu in the LGBT subject. For me, this is very vague. What do you mean public interest? Do you mean public tolerance? Or do you mean there are more people in these provinces who are LGBT united? Or those LGBT people are more open? So this is something I found very vague. Really, I don't know how much you want to talk about public interests. Public interest could be positive and also could be negative. So really, this term, when I read this term, I also listened to presentation, I try to figure out what you want to tell us. People just talk about that. That term just appeared in the Baidu. So what? So this is something you might want to think more deeply about what do you really want to convey for the dependent variable. What I think I would be interested would be the status of LGBT people in this society, in different provinces, variation. It's not simply people talk about, how people talk about, what people talk about. You have all those data, you have all those different terms. So how divide them into different types of interests in the LGBT population? You talked about the LGBT people were stigmatized, were somehow not tolerated. So when you saw those expressions in those media, with those, will collect those data, what does that tell you or tell us about the status? In fact, for me, LGBT people in China is a very low-key, very low-key, not like the Western society. People get some preferential treatments or kind of benefits. China does not have those things. Even as Professor Feng mentioned, in the marriage status, legal status are not clear. So this is a dependent variable. Really, I want to define that very clearly and also measure that very clearly. In the independent variable part, I also, Professor Feng's comments, I think very interesting. You simply use the modernization theory framework. Just when the modernization theory talks most on the political aspects, economic development will produce political liberalization. Here you just said it will produce more interests in the LGBT. It's nothing wrong. There's nothing wrong that, but you have to make that clear. If that's the case, it's a very conventional explanation, which is okay. You just tell us the modernization theory now could be used for this sociological phenomenon. So that should be interesting. So I just want to be very clear about your methodology, about your message, all those things. This paper itself, I think, is very interesting. I have received quite submissions and also published quite a few articles on LGBT and homosexual, all those issues. These are very, very hot topic. So you really want to produce something people can learn from, go beyond those other researchers. And so in that case, you said that there's a very little research on this. You really, I don't know how much you have dug into the literature. You really want to dive into the literature on the China side. In the West, I think it's a huge literature already. Okay, I think those are my comments. I really like this paper for sure. Now the floor is open. Okay, Professor Xie Yu wants to make a comment from Stanford University.
No,
not Stanford, Princeton. Sorry. You are from Princeton.
I have two kind of questions or comments. One has to do with the measure, outcome measure. There is as Professor Fong mentioned, that your dependent variable could, or the independent variable could reflect the internet usage. And I find that also problematic. We have done the same with Google. So first of all, Professor Zhao, there is always a lack of information with this kind of data. You don't get everything. So you have to make the best out of it. So one is just a question, if I give you comments. So Professor Wang, you used the raw counts, not the normalized counts, right, of searches?
I think it's standardized. I think it's a normalized counts.
Yeah, that makes a huge difference. So if it's a normalized by some usage, then it's less sensitive to the criticisms. You're safer to criticisms of internet use, because you do want to get a normalized measure of those usage against other usages. Otherwise, it's a purely function of internet users or intensive users or speed of internet and so on. So you want to make sure the counts are normalized somehow by some objective. Otherwise, you want to use other as possible ways of normalizing. Say you can use like marriage as a frequency. You check your it's called a placebo. You check your model. You use instead of LGBT, you can use like a marriage to see you get the same results or something else. Let me get to my second suggestion that's more relevant to Professor Zhao's criticism. Maybe what you can do in those searches, instead of doing just searches like a 同性恋 or 同志 or something, maybe you can look for phrases that go with it, such as looking for 找 或者是约会 or just some kind of action that gives you more meaning to the noun, because most of those are nouns. Maybe you can find they're looking for that kind of behavior information to homosexuality networks or clubs or behaviors. Maybe that using that as at least as a robust check to see if the results are similar, if you use more concrete action words instead of just words that could be negative and positive. Just, I think in Google you can do that. Usually you can Chinese, you can say Chinese or cheap, or Chinese good, or Chinese culture or something. Usually there are search words that go together with a keyword. So you find adjacent words that go with homosexuality. That will give you more credibility to your analysis if you add more phrases that go with nouns. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Professor Xie.
I think these are very good comments. Professor Xie Yu is authority on the survey research and the image research. He just produced a special issue for us on the subject. So I'm so grateful for his comments. Okay, so we don't have much time left for this paper. Anyone have more questions? If not, Professor Wang, you might make some brief responses.
Okay, yeah. So so thank you so much. And So in terms of the first comments by Professor Feng, so here I didn't make it very clear. So actually in 1997, homosexuality was no longer regarded as a mental health problem. I think you're right. The homosexual marriage was not legalized, but homosexuality was no longer regarded as a mental health problem. And I also agree with that. I also need to end more theoretical justification in terms of the debate about modernization. And and I will also include, for example, more variables such as human development index, and try to control for example, internet access or cell phone access. And I'll also try to explore whether the year variable and why it's negative and what is going on is variable. And also, according to Professor Zhao and Professor Xie's comments, I think, I'll also include some other measures of keywords, try to classify them into different types. Yeah, I think they all are very valuable and constructive comments. I believe these comments can really help this paper, help me to further improve this paper. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you. And my assistant told me Shi Ma raised hand had questions, and still have a few minutes for this paper. So now, Professor Ma, identify yourself, who you are.
Hi, so I am still a PhD student at Cornell University, so not yet a professor. But okay. So I just have a very short question about what indicators you used in this analysis. So because when I kind of like kind of explore what Baidu Index is about, I noticed there are 3 indicators. So first, it's about the number of searches in provinces. So kind of to measure the how people actively look for this type of information. And second one is more about how people passively receive those type of information. And thirdly is about media's attention to this issue. So I'm just wondering, like, what indicators you use as dependent variable and why not using the other 2 as dependent variables as well?
Sorry, so you mentioned why not use the other 2, and here we just do the principal component effect analysis to derive the LGBT index.
Well, so what I see from this, kind of like Baidu actually has a introduction of what Baidu Index is about, and so on this page, it says that there are 3 types of indicators that could be considered as Baidu Index. So, are you suggesting that it's what you got is kind of like a PDA results combining the 3 indicators, or because I can actually, is there a way for me to?
Okay, so in terms of data collection, I probably need to check with my co-author because I was not responsible for collecting the online data yet. Yeah. So, but thank you for your comments. I will make it clear. I will try to make it clear in the paper about how the data were collected.
Thank you.
Okay, I think we have had a very good discussion about this paper, which I think very interesting, important. And now we move to our 3rd paper, which we shift order because Professor Molly Roberts from UCSD has some kind of personal matter cannot make it now, but she will arrive a little bit late. So let's move the 4th paper to the 3rd by Professor Meng Tianguang, Professor Meng Tianguang from Department of Poli Sci at Tsinghua University. The topic of the paper is the national identity of locality, the state, patriotism, and nationalism in cyber China.
Hi, Professor Zhao. Can you hear me clearly?
Yeah, we can hear you. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So can you also show my slides?
Yeah, we can see your slide. Yes.
Thank you. Thanks a lot for Professor Zhao to organize this wonderful online workshop. My name is Tian Guangmen. I will report one recent paper titled as National Identity of Locality, the State, Patriotism, and Nationalism in Stable China. So this paper is co-authored with two of my students. So I believe them they should around the computer to solve the process. So we are really looking forward to your comments and suggestions to help us. So this paper is actually I think the idea is very brief. Our motivation is quite straightforward. Generally, we have two motivation. One is methodologically, we want to find another way, or alternative way, to the traditional survey method to measure national identity with a new kind of data like social media data. I actually use a survey method to do a lot of political science research to measure national identity, political trust, political support, this kind of concept for many years. But we do observe this kind of measure in China. They suffer a lot of challenges methodologically, especially the first one is we call the social disability bias. So that means that people will hide their true attitudes towards sensitive questions like nationalism or political trust or something like that. Another chance is actually the big data. Because the size of data and also the penetration of the internet in China, they offer us new chance, to collect longitudinal data, to understand the dynamics of key, political concepts like national identity. So this is the first motivation. The second one is actually we want to explain the difference, the regional difference of national identity. In China. We understand the regional variation from the perspective of state capacity. So national identity, of course, is one consequence of the national building or state building. So we are really care about how state richness or state penetration into ordinary people's daily life, they actually shape the national identity. So this is two motivation. The first thing we want to discuss is actually how to define national identity. So actually, a lot of political scientists and sociologists, when they study like China, especially they care about like identity because that can explain a lot, political attitudes or behavior like. Some scholar, attribute like nationalism is one source of legitimacy in China. So the nationalized people, they are more likely to, to support the regime, and they also, likely to participate into the enemy protests or something like that. But we are really reconsider the definition of the concept. So we think the national identity, because they define the relationship between the self and the others. So generally, I actually maybe 6 or 5 years ago, I worked with my supervisor, Professor Shen Mingming, and also another professor, IR professor in Johnston. We actually reconsider the concept because we think the national identity should have two sub concepts. The first one is the nationalism. The nationalism actually help us to understand how we define us, by compare us with the others. That's actually captures the outgroup derogation, but the patriotism is actually a measure how we how we regard ourselves. It's a in-group love or belongingness to the our own community. So they are really different concept. So in this paper, we try to define national identity as these two, sub-concepts, nationalism and patriotism. And also some previous empirical study from IR scholar and also political scientists do prove that nationalism is not equal to patriotism in China. So we want to capture this with a new kind of data. So this is actually give you a basic knowledge, picture about finding from our social media analysis. So the left figure is actually shows the distribution of nationalism in Chinese cities. The right one is the patriotism in Chinese cities. If you look at the pattern, you find they have some like similarity, but they are also very different. For example, lots of eastern region and middle region, cities in China, they are quite patriotism, but they are not so nationalism. So theoretically, lots of literature actually talk about the source of national identity. For example, the culturalist scholars, they believe like the national identity come from history, culture, mythology, these kind of religions. And the constructivism, they think the national identity is constructed by the social elites or political elites through like mass media, printing, publications. And also political scientists, they propose functionalism. They think the modernization actually, they need the unified, mass education that actually results in the formation of national identity. So this is a traditional explanation. But the traditional literature do regard national identity as a unitary, things. They do not care about the role of the state in making national identity. That means the state richness or state patronation that may have influence on the formation of national identity, but the traditional literature didn't touch that a lot. So of course, another thing is actually the traditional study that do not care about the subnational level national identity. That means the regional variation. So our key question theoretically is what factors cause regional variation, especially the role of the state. So we use social media data from Sina Weibo, to measure the dependent variable, and also we formed a panel data in the prefecture city level to form a panel data, and then we identify the relationship between the state capacity and also the national identity. So hypothesis, we actually have two sets of hypotheses. The first set hypothesis related to we call the globalization, because the traditional wisdom tell us globalization actually eroded the national identity, especially after the 21st century. So we want to examine that again. But our main focus is state capacity. So we care about how but of course, the state have lots of capacity, right? A lot of scholars like McMahon, like Fukuyama, like Wang Shaoguang, they talk about state capacity, but we only care about the state capacity. They have the potential to influence ordinary people's daily life, because they make the people touch the state or access the state. So to be specific, we focus three kind of state capacity. The first one is extraction capacity. That means you tax people. The second one is the redistributive capacity. That means you give give social goods to the people. The third one is information capacity. It's a capacity to do propaganda or information management. So the first hypothesis is we believe globalization will reduce national identity, both nationalism and patriotism. In terms of extraction capacity, because they may have two, different way, to explain the relationship. The first one is because the extraction capacity, they can enhance state capacity to offer public goods, so they may stress the national identity, but they also may, because they give you tax burden, to hurt the people, especially ordinary people. So they may also decrease the national identity. We predict two ways we want to test that. The third hypothesis is about redistribution, because we believe redistribution because they offer public goods to the people, especially for China. The communist ideology they propose, promotes this idea. So we believe redistribution capacity will enhance, national identity. The last one is the information capacity. We think because information, the government through information channels, they can do propaganda, do information control. So that should stress national identity. So this is our, hypothesis. As for the methods, firstly, we collect, 20 million Weibo posts from 2012 to 2017. It's a random sample. It's a small piece of the whole Weibo posts, but it's already quite huge for us. And then we identify the location of the Weibo posts. We found 266 where the CD sample because it's a panel. So we have like 1,600 observations in the final data sets. We use fixed effect panel data model to estimate the effects. So it's quite simple, but the most difficult part is about the social media data analysis. So firstly, we want to measure two interesting dependent variable, but the Weibo data is quite short to identify, minimal topic. So we do not using topic model kind of, unsupervised learning approach. We use the supervised learning approach. So firstly, we randomly select 5,000 parts to construct a training set to make a coding by our RAs. So this is actually the first step. We use the key terms to extract a valid sample because that sample should be related to national identity. Because a lot of Weibo users, they do not care about this topic. So firstly, we use this about 50 keywords to select a valid sample to be a training set. Secondly, we instruct two graduate students to read about 5,000 sample to identify each sample's category or classification. So this is the coding book about patriotism, and also this is the nationalism. So of course we have lots of details in the appendix because of time. So I just stop here. But we do spend a lot of time to develop this kind of coding books to instruct our RAs. The third step, we use training set and also use different machine learning method to predict the rest of the data. So we actually use this like a logistic regression, random forest, decision tree, SVC, this kind of predictors, to predict the whole data. And this here I list the performance of our supervised machine learning. It looks quite good. So we can technically we can believe the results from the machine learning. So here we offer several examples of what is the nationalist path. So if you look at this content, you can generally understand that the nationalists mainly talk about ordinary people's attitudes or orientation and also behaviors to against the others, to criticize the others. Patriotism, paths, they actually mainly talk about the ordinary people use, they do behavior, love the country, or they visit the patriotic, education starts, also they show their emotion or sentiment to love the country, this kind of path. So our dependent variable is very simple, is a national identity of the ordinary people in a given city. And the intimate variable include like globalization is FDI percentage to the GDP, and also the extraction capacity is the ratio of tax extraction in GDP, and also we use pension coverage rate to measure redistribution capacity. The last one is we use ICT penetration to measure information capacity. So this is basic distribution of our variables. So we come back to this figure. We can look at the distribution of nationalism in the left figure and patriotism in the right. You can find that they do have huge regional variation. So we have them. We should explain that. So here we do some validation about our key measurement of the different variable. Here we use the outside data source like the 坐标 data. It's because 坐标 data is they offer huge survey records. So in the 坐标 survey, they have some question about national identity. Here we actually calculate the provincial level 坐标 finding at our big data social media finding. We calculate the correlation. We find that they are really positively correlated with each other. That means this is an external validation of our social media measurement. And also, oh sorry, here I don't know why I have this kind of red circles, but here we actually we also use topic model to classify the key topics of the Weibo posts. So we made like about 20 topics, and also we do a correlation analysis to between the topics and also the national identity. So we do find that, for example, the left figure is actually when people talk different issues, do they show stronger nationalism or weak nationalism? We do find that, for example, when Chinese people talk about like the foreign relationship and also like the international relationship, they will tend to show stronger nationalism. As the left right actually show reverse scenes, because they test the relationship between the patriotism and also the topic of the past. We find that, for example, when the people talk about social protection issues, they may tend to show stronger patriotism. So they're really different. And also we do another validation. For example, we try to capture the does the bills or the income influence your your attitudes of nationalism or patriotism. So here we use for example, people will use different machines or device to post something. For example, the Huawei user, they do show more patriotism than the other like Apple's user. But in terms of nationalism, they are really very close among different users. They use different device. So the right figure actually shows the gender. Does gender matters for show nationalism or patriotism? We do find that the female actually more likely to show patriotism, but the male people, they are more nationalism. This is also consistent with our feelings in China. And here we show another validation of our measurement. We graph the monthly extent of the nationalism and also the patriotism. The left figure is the nationalism. We do find that nationalism is the bomb of the nationalism or dynamics of nationalism is generally the event driven. For example, in 2016 and 2018 is actually the SARS crisis and also the China-US trade war. They make people look small nationalism, but the patriotism, they're always high. So this is really consistent with our theory, because nationalism is not always we are everyday nationalism. It's important, but we are more like the everyday patriotic patriotism, because we love our country, and also the trend of the patriotism is actually increased over time. So here is it's a panel data findings. We do find that because of times, I will give a very simple summary. The first one is we do find that globalization reduce nationalism, but they do not influence patriotism. So that's also quite interesting. And also the tax extraction, they have no influence on both dimension, nationalism and also patriotism. But the pension system, if you offer more social goods to the people, and also to cover more people, the nationalism will increase, and also the patriotism will increase, because the people will pride of that, and also they get benefit from the state, so they will have the belongings to their own community, particular community. But the information capacity, they only influence nationalism, and they improve nationalism, but they have no influence on the patriotism. So that is also quite surprised, because traditionally we think propaganda, they should improve both, but we actually find that propaganda only influence nationalism. So that's also quite interesting in practical application for the propaganda system, So to be summarized, I also already do some simple summary. So our key contribution is 3 dimensions. The first one, here we try to understand how state capacity, especially how state reach the daily life of the ordinary people, shape national identity in cyberspace. Secondly, we divide national identity into nationalism and patriotism, and also we measure that. We do find that they are really different, so that have some theoretical contribution to the field. The third one is we develop some new method to, especially we develop a new training set that can be used by different scholars. We will open that for the community, and also we detect the effectiveness of different methods to predict political value from social media data that can be applied for the other topics. For example, we use this method to do collectivism and individualism during COVID-19. We also use Weibo data to do that. So that produce us a new kind of measurement to replace traditional survey data, because survey data is very expensive, and also survey data, you can't do survey every day, but mass media data or social media data that can offer this kind of goodness for us. Thanks a lot. We're really looking forward to your comments. Sorry about the time. Professor Zhao.
Okay, thank you, Professor Meng. Now the discussant is Professor Jingyan Jiang from Poli-Sci Department at Columbia University.
All right, can you guys hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
All right. Well, thanks for having me, and thanks to Josh and Tianguo for inviting me and putting me on this panel and to read this very, very interesting paper. I really sort of enjoyed reading it and learned a lot. So I just want to sort of start by saying that I think this is a really great paper. It tackles a very important and sort of timely topic, and nationalism in China, and uses a very sort of novel method, using social media data basically to construct these city level measures of nationalism, right, for each of the Chinese cities. And this is not something that I've ever seen before, and I think, at least personally, I think this is something of great potential. Right? And also, theoretically, I really appreciate, there's a sort of a very much a sort of a degree of a theoretical nuance in there, right? I mean, you sort of unpack nationalism by distinction between sort of nationalism versus patriotism, right? So nationalism is more sort of I'll say aggressive or sort of offensive kind of sentiment versus patriotism, which is more sort of inward looking, right? So I think these are really sort of interesting and sort of nice features of this paper, and and also I think this paper is already sort of quite polished, and so I have some comments and suggestions, but you should take them as as really just sort of complementary to what you already have, and which is already pretty great. So I have a couple of suggestions for you to further sort of improve and strengthen this paper. One main big suggestion I think is that I feel that the current version of the paper is sort of a little bit too. There are a lot of things going on in this paper, right? So I feel like this paper could have been streamlined a little bit. Right? So right now it seems that the paper has at least two things going on in there. One thing that you're trying to do in the paper is to, well, basically come up with this, a measure of nationalism, right? From using social media data, right? And then show, how this is actually a valid measure and how this measure sort of varies with various kind of things that you think they should be sort of correlated with. Right? So that's one thing you're trying to do. But aside from that, there's also a second thing that you're trying to do in the paper, which is try to sort of tell a story of how nationalism or patriotism is related to state capacity. Right? Personally, I feel like the first story is actually more interesting because we didn't really have a measure, right, on city level measure on national, or at city level time varying measure on nationalism to begin with. So I think even if you just focus on that, the contribution will be significant enough, and I'm sure this is a measure that once you have it, everybody will want to sort of ask you for the data and to use it, right? So I think that is already a very significant contribution of itself, right? The second story, the story about the relationship between nationalism and the state capacity, I feel like that one could be that one probably still needs a little bit more work at this stage, because there are people may have questions about for instance, why should we think that these two things are somehow related, and in what kind of literature are you really engaging with, right? And also the measures you have in the paper about state capacity, they're really just local state capacity, right? And then people may have questions about why should people's feeling towards the nation be only affected by local state capacity, right? So if you think about all these big books on nationalism, it's really about national level events. It's not about what happened in your city. Right? I mean, after all, it's nationalism, right? Nationalism should be something about the nation, not the where you live, the city you live in. So I think these are some issues that you might want to sort of think about. Also, sort of conceptually, one thing you might want to think about is what is the relationship between nationalism and national identity. Right? So in the paper, you seem to sort of use these two words interchangeably. The title has national identity, and then if you look at the paper, it's really about nationalism. Right? So are these the same? Right? So my understanding of national identity. My understanding is that national identity is really about in the Chinese context about whether you think you're a Chinese, right? So if you're not in mainland China, then there is a question of whether you think you're Chinese or some other identity, or what you think makes you Chinese, whether it's the cultural heritage, the political or historical elements, right? So this is what national identity is about. Nationalism seems to be about something else, and nationalism is more about assuming that you already have this identity of Chinese. Then do you like being a Chinese, or how much do you like being a Chinese, right? And how you see China's place in the world in relation to say other actors or other countries. Right? So I feel like there's a slight sort of difference between these two things. Right? So it'd be useful to sort of clarify that a little bit in the paper. Another sort of small point about the distinction between like nationalism and patriotism. Right? So one of your findings seems to be like patriotism is more stable, right? Nationalism is sort of more erratic and fluctuating. But looking at your the way you code these posts, it seems that a simpler interpretation would be like, isn't nationalism just like people being angry? I mean, you can't be like angry all the time, right? I mean, unless you're Hulk or something. But like if it's just people being angry, then of course you would imagine that it's not going to happen like all the time, right? It's not going to be it has to be like have these spikes, right? So is it just being angry? And also there might be this issue of sort of representativeness, right? Since you are using Weibo data, and that is sort of unavoidable because I think I very much echo with Zhao Laoshi's early point that the Weibo users are a very special sort of population. I mean, no matter how you look at it, it's very special, right? And so to what extent are they representative, right? Or especially if you think about what you're trying to do with this measure, right? You're trying to construct a city level measure. So to what extent are they representative of the city from which the post seems to be coming from, right? We don't really know where the posts actually, where the authors of the posts actually are, right? But we have their IP and other things. So I think that would be an issue to sort of think about. And this is also related to Josh's comment about the difference between big data and survey research, right? So what is the value of using big data in this case when we know that a lot of the existing research on ideology is done through surveys. Right? So I think you can make a sort of good case there by pointing to the fact that you're doing this time varying panel thing, right? But I think it will be useful to sort of emphasize that at least in the paper. Right? The last point is actually, I feel like it's a little bit like a cheap shot, but I guess if you're gonna submit this to a journal, eventually you'll be asked by this question, right? So I mean, how should we think about the issues like censorship and trolling? Yeah. So this is Weibo, right? So the Weibo has its problems. So some posts got taken down and other posts were added by trolls, right? So how do we know that these are posts, the posts that you're looking at actually contributed by real ordinary people, right? Instead of just companies or hired guns of the government, right? So I think that's also another thing that you would want to have an answer in the sort of in writing up the sort of final version of the paper, right? So that's all I want to say. But overall, I think this is a really interesting paper and has a lot of great potential. So thanks for writing such a great paper, and I look forward to seeing it's being published in somewhere in the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Jiang, for your comments. Let me add a little bit on this paper, since I'm myself have done a lot on nationalism. So I look at this paper and find some confusions about concepts. As Professor Jiang mentioned, national identity, you talk locality. When I thought that, I thought it talked about localization of national identity. The citizens would identify with a nation, but with the variations, different, you said state, local state capacity or whatever. They will have more identity with local localities or province level and on the president level or a national level, how these different identities has been contributed or influenced the national identity. So that was what I was looking forward when I saw this title. Then I look at state, patriotism, and nationalism. You parallel the three concepts, which they are cannot be parallel. The state is, in your research, independent variable, and the nationalism and patriotism are dependent variable. Yeah. So this is so confusing to me. So I try to figure out. When I did not know that until I read the paper. I know the state is an independent variable. Then you talk about different state capacity, globalization. All those different variables have influenced. It's not identity. You influence nationalism. But you divide nationalism into nationalism versus patriotism, which is again confusing to me too. because very often nationalism and patriotism, they are just different terms for the same sentiments to the nation, or to the state, or to the country, whatever you want to say it. But you try to distinguish patriotism from nationalism, which I am not convinced by the distinction. You talk about patriotism is more stable and pervasive, which so what? And nationalism is a more instant and erratic. So here, the distinction, when people talk about nationalism, they are talking about the kind of affirmative nationalism versus aggressive nationalism, inward looking versus outward looking. Try to be more assertive versus we, and between we and thee. This type of distinction, but the pervasive, erratic, or you can people talk about more emotional, people popular level, more in my own research, more emotional, and at a state level, more pragmatic. So here there are so many different distinctions of nationalism, but you try use the two terms with the same sentiments to distinguish them. And so that's very, for me, it's very confusing here. I don't want to challenge your intention and also your methodology here, which I'm not familiar with. But that conceptually, I try to figure out what you want to tell us by this distinction. I cannot figure it out. With the strong state capacity, with the what you talk about, all those hypotheses, would people become more, taxation, all those things, people more identify with the state, or people have more hatred against foreigners? And those are the questions people are exploring, and also the literature have focused on. And from your research, I really just this kind of distinction and using those city level socioeconomic data, which I think is impressive, but I really don't know what exactly you want to tell us, your research, and what type of, other than methodology, what kind of contribution to the literature. For me, it's a confusion. Maybe I did not read it carefully, but that's what, because when I got those kind of methodology part, I'm sometimes confused myself. But then I look for the meat, so-called meat are the argument. And what I have learned, what I don't know in the past, I really don't get it. That's the problem for me for reading this paper. Okay, I stop here. Let's open up to the audience. Who will have any questions, comments, suggestions? Maybe this article is too sophisticated for people to make comments. Okay, Sincere.
Ask a question. I think this is a very, very interesting question.
We cannot hear you well. Can you?
Okay. Can you hear me now?
Okay.
Okay. So yeah, this is a very, very interesting question, because identity is what I'm trying to do. It seems that national identity is a social identity. You identify with the country, right? With the country, with the nation. So it can be, there can be many layers of meanings here. So it can be based on place, for example, China, US, or any other country, right? So I just love the place, culture, you know, everything. So so that's one layer. I think when you distinguish between nationalism and patriotism, I think you're talking about the difference between in-group versus out-group. So it's the two sides of the same coin, right? So because you, when you distinguish a group of people, Chinese, for example, from the rest of the world, or Americans from the rest of the world, you always attribute a lot of good qualities to the in-group people. And so to distinguish this in-group from the out-group people will be dehumanized, right? So it's all the bad qualities, negative qualities, you would attribute to that, to the out-group. So so it's always, you know, like it's I think it's always the two sides of the same coin. I think that's the distinction you were trying to make. Maybe, you know, if maybe you could clarify what you're talking about, right? Because when people hear identity, there are so many different ways of using the word identity, and you know, identity is always about identifying with something, or you know, or in relationship, or relative to other people also. So we want to make sure what people understand what you're talking about. I do, you know, I did learn a lot of things from this, and this is wonderful. This seems to be.
We cannot hear you now.
Oh, okay. I said I did learn a lot of things from this, and I hope, you know, if I have questions or whatever, I can ask you guys. Everybody.
Okay. Any more comments? Anyone? Okay, then we can move on. You can give some responses.
Okay, thanks, Professor Jiang, Professor Zhao, and also Professor Zhang's comments and suggestions. So I think to be summed, I think the first one is actually it's about the concept definition. So I actually I think we do need to clarify a lot about our you know concept definition. So we do develop the concept of nationalism and patriotism from the perspective of identity, because identity theory actually talk about the relationship between the self and the other. So the nationalism, it's actually in the state level, we try to measure how the citizen perceive you know, the in-group you know love, and also the out-group you know definition or something like that. So it's actually the out-group you know ones is actually nationalism, but the in-group ones is actually patriotism. So we actually have that part in the theoretical part. So this is the first definition. So generally, the three concepts that do you know discussed by the previous study, you know in the same time, or you know, to the similar phenomenon like national identity, nationalism, and also patriotism. So they are strongly related with each other, but I think theoretically they are really different because they have different source. One is in-group, you know, bias. Another one is out-group bias. So so of course, with the empirical analysis, we do find that they are different. They are different. That means one people, if they are nationalism, they are not necessarily you know patriotism. They are not you know totally the same thing. You know, they are different. So second one is actually about the state capacity, how state capacity, you know, why state capacity influence national identity, because national identity is one source or one consequence or one outcome of the national building. But the national building come from the you know national capacity. That means national capacity is it's one dimension of national building. So that theoretically they have consequence for the formation of national identities. So the previous political scientist literature talk about that, but in China this theory do not test precisely. So we try to do that. And also, thanks a lot for Professor Jiang's comments about the national capacity as a local, national level state capacity and local state capacity. I agree with you, but it's really difficult to measure, how the national capacity existed in the local. So we actually use because the city, they can only know or perceive, or they can only feel the local state capacity. They use the local state capacity to refer the national state capacity. So this we do need to do more, literature and also theory development, to link the national state capacity and the local state capacity to say their relationship or their, and also the third one is about methods. So of course, the Weibo data, we actually use the Weibo data from 2012 to 2017. So actually, I believe the censorship do have some influence on the data, collection. But it's we can't, solve that problem, So of course, I think one good thing is actually the censorship, they do not censor lots of like patriotism or nationalism things, even unless you have the collective action potential. So we do a lot of tests to the data quality. So I believe the data is it's because we have better data. So I think this one should be useful for understand political values in cyber space. So we only refer the population as cyber citizens or netizens. So the last one is it's a survey and also like the survey method, and also a social media approach to measure some like concept in social sciences. So because I do a lot of survey, so we always use survey to measure this kind of abstract concept. But the survey method, I think the first one is they suffer the social desirability bias. So that means when, for example, in China, if we use the survey method to measure national identity or nationalism, we always have a high level, estimation. But that's actually we have to question that. Because our measure actually finds that the people that care about nationalism is very less. It's less than 5% in the whole population. But if we do survey, we find that the whole country is nationalism. They may have like more than 60 kind of people. They have the nationalism potential. Orientation or something like that. So this is because I believe it's because of the social desirability bias. So we do this experiment to measure the gap. We do find that the social desirability bias exist in this kind of situation because the people, it's a good political rightness, to say you hate like Japan or America in China. But patriotism, we do not find big change between the survey and also the the social media, because they do not suffer that bias. Okay, so that's my response. So I think the most important thing is to define the concept, and also to solve the Professor Zhao proposed the question, to clarify our key hypothesis, and also the relationship between the dependent variable and also independent variable. Thank you. Thanks a lot.
Could I ask a quick question? Hello, Sam.
Professor,
yes, please go.
Yeah,
Professor
let me. Yeah, I like the work, Tianguang. Very good. Could you send me a copy of your article? I have one quick question. Is most people tell me that the younger generation are more national, the younger generation is more nationalistic than older generation. So there is a clear cohort effect. I don't know if you have, I missed it or somewhere. Do you find a large cohort effect by both cohort?
Thanks, Professor Xie. So we do not have direct evidence for that, for the cohort.
Some of them actually say their age, right? Large percentage of them indicate their age.
Yeah, we do not do that part, but empirically, but we do an alternative way. We measure the topics of the social media posts, because the people that talk a lot online games or like entertainment, they may more likely to be the younger generation. We do find that that makes sense, because including the sports, this kind of people, they're more nationalism. Yeah, we can do other type.
Yeah, some posters do give their age. So if you use the age, you probably can make some inferences. Not everyone gives age, but some of them do. Okay, thank you.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you, Professor Xie. And here for me is really you have to distinguish identity versus nationalism. You have to focus one or the other. Here is a very confusing between identity and nationalism, patriotism. That's the key here. Okay, so let's move on to the final paper, which I think should be very interesting to many people and also timely for the current political development in China. That is by Professor Jessica West from Cornell University. The topic is a strong state or vulnerable homeland, how Chinese state media sought to combat democratic diffusion from Hong Kong. Now, Hong Kong issue should be very interesting now. Professor West.
Thank you very much, and thank you to the organizers for inviting us to participate. This paper is joint with Shuqi Ma, a PhD student here at Cornell. And our paper looks at how it is that the Chinese government has reacted to the 2019 Hong Kong protests, seeking to combat the possibility of democratic diffusion from Hong Kong. For the rest of the presentation, I'm going to let Shuqi take over the presentation. She is an equal, if not more co-equal co-author in this project.
Hi, King. I think right now I'm not muted anymore. So thank you, Jessica, for introducing this topic. And we want to start with like general puzzles that we encounter when we look at the Hong Kong's protests back in 2019. So as we all know, as political scientists, that the autocrats' prevention of democratic diffusion is no longer a new story, and especially like in the Chinese context. So the question is, what new phenomenon do we see in the Chinese government's and citizens' reaction to the democratic movements during the Hong Kong protests in 2019? And the very short answer is we saw this rising digital activism in endorsing the Chinese state to fight against the Hong Kong protest. And for example, this is not a thing that we actually see back during the umbrella movement back in 2014, not to mention the periods of the Color Revolution or the Arab Spring. So what we can see is that this hashtag on Chinese Twitter, the Weibo, I also support Hong Kong police, has been shared for more than 2 million of times, and also it has been used for more than 10 million times by the Chinese netizens. And also we see some like celebrities in the entertainment industry openly announce its support to the Chinese state when the democratic movement took place in Hong Kong. So there are many explanations of why do we actually see this digital activism in the Chinese cyberspace. And of course, one of the most aspects is how the Chinese party state actually frames people's perceptions of the democratic trend that is taking place. And so from that, we actually examined how do the party state manage the media, and kind of like how the state control media portray the movement in a way to shape people's beliefs. And we noticed that the party state's management strategy also looks kind of different in 2019. So for example, there was a conflict between the police force and the protesters in the Shatin district, Hong Kong, on July 15th. And naturally, that the Hong Kong television channel, the TVB, provided a very detailed reports about what was going on. But to many people's surprise, like the videos and pictures of this conflicts became available as well on many Chinese news agencies' websites that is considered as under the censorship. So having said that, we actually developed our research question. So firstly is, as more information about the protest became available to domestic readers during this protest in 2019, what framing strategies did the party state use to discourage people from sympathizing with the protesters? And more specifically, we wonder, how did the party state strategies change over time as the movement continue, whether there's a temporal pattern embedded in this during this period. So before we jumped directly into our findings, we wanted to talk more about how our research is positioned in this general literature about Chinese party state's management of the media. So Molly Roberts, in her great work, talking about that there are mainly three ways for the state to manage information. So first is to using fear. That is to kind of like put some social activists in detention. And the second is to use friction. So that's most commonly we've seen for example, like blocking some sensitive words or deleting some of the contents that is considered as not serving the purpose of the state or of the political elites. And the third way we talk about is flooding. So the existing literature said that the Chinese party state actually hired a bunch of, for example, the 5 Cents Army to post comments that cheerleading the current leaders or the current regime to actually distract the reader's audience from paying more attention to a lot of like controversial topics. And also it could happen to some like state-run media news agency, also as a way to kind of like make people pay less attention to things that is going on. However, like we argue that the flooding strategy can also be used to attract people's attention to a particular topic. And in our case, to analyze how autocrats actually prevent the diffusion of a democratic trend, we argue that to attract citizens' attention while keeping the citizens kind of like ensuring the citizens not challenging the current regime, is that there are two ways for autocrats to do that. So first is called, it's a kind of like a demobilizing process, that is to demobilize the potential regime opponents, kind of to emphasizing that a state is capable enough of launching repression if they wanted to kind of like they wanted to kind of engage themselves in type of anti-regime activities. And second one is to actually rally the regime supporters. So the attraction strategy is not to actually deter, it's not only just to deter citizens or to deter the potential components, but actually to kind of like enhance the regime support base by describing the state as kind of like a vulnerable homeland that is threatened by, for example, firstly, the pro-democracy tendency, and secondly, the foreign intervention of the Western countries, so that the citizens become more, the citizens were kind of like rallying around the national flag to protect their homeland against a lot of like new political forces. So So to actually examine, answer the question of how does the Chinese Party states actually use this attraction strategy, whether it's to actually demobilize the opponents or whether it's to rally the regime supporters, we actually collect data based on so far 281 news articles about the Hong Kong protests published by the People's Daily from June 2019 to January 2020. And so far still we hand coded the content of the news articles, but we're kind of like looking for a new automatic way for us to kind of incorporate more observations into our analysis. And the main results are listed as follows. So firstly, we find that there was overall reliances on the rallying strategy as compared to the demobilizing strategy, so that there were more articles talking about which served the purpose of rallying the citizens and encourage them to stand out against this pro-democracy trend. And this tendency, in terms of the temporal change, this tendency got particularly intensified at a later stage of the protest movements. And we go further to actually compare how the Chinese media actually select the events and protests in Hong Kong with what actually happened in Hong Kong. And we find that, interestingly enough, that the Chinese media dropped some stories that would make the state look repressive. So it actually shows that the media put less emphasis on demobilizing the opponents as opposed to rallying the regime supporters. So this part, we will talk about how we actually derived our theory and our hypothesis. In the literature of how autocrats actually maintain their power, facing the democratic trend, there are basically two approaches. So first for autocrats is to demobilize the opponents, and this process of demobilization usually involves the changes of the costs and benefits of engaging in protest. Some scholars would say that we see the diffusion of democratic movement because when people witnessing the occurrence of democratic movements in their neighboring regions, they either, according to Henry and Hell, believe that the authoritarian regime is vulnerable to, they're more inclined to believe that authoritarian regimes are vulnerable to external threats, or as Bonds and Wojcik suggest, that at the operational level, those the pre-existing movements actually provide a roadmap for the potential opponents to organize their activities to kind of, they're more informed of how efficient they will challenge the states, seeing some cases previously. So, but besides that, we need to be aware that there are other two important factors related to individuals' calculation of how costly it would be for them to actually involved in any type of anti-regime activities. First and most directly is the state's repressive determination and capacity. So if they're facing a state that is more willing to launch a punishment and also capable to do so, more individuals will be concerned about the price that they would pay to engage in this type of democratic protest. And also it could, the price of the protest could be related to the scale of the protest. And for example, like Karen suggests, that when a round of protest involves more participants, it also means that for the state, for the authoritarian state, it becomes harder for them to actually identify the key players, so that they could, it become more difficult for them to launch any kind of discriminative punishment, and also the price of launching the punishment would be higher. So building on those theories of the cost of the protest for autocrats in their management of the media, distraction strategy would say that simply for autocrats is to is to block the citizens' access and their exposure to the occurrence of the democratic movements in their neighboring regions, so that when citizens don't have that type of information, they would not kind of like neither borrow the previous experience of organizing the protest, or kind of like change their beliefs about how vulnerable a authoritarian regime could be. But however, for attraction strategy, the autocrats actually start from the other two factors, like design their strategies based on the other two factors. So they could either persuade the potential opponents to believe that the state is capable and determined enough to launch repression and punishment on any type of activities that will be considered as anti-regime. And also they could kind of like downplay the scale of the protest to show that, well, these protests is not powerful enough to threaten the foundation of authoritarianism. And also because of the limited scale of the protest, it's easier for the state and the police force to actually identify the organizers and participants, and the likelihood of the punishment would be high. So from there, we actually derived our first set of hypotheses. That is to say, if the Chinese media is to, the state-run media is actually to demobilize the potential opponents when the Hong Kong protests actually take place, those type of articles would be kind of to either stress the police efforts to break up the protest and arrest individuals, or they should kind of like downplay the scale of the protest, describing it as launched by some marginal groups of Hong Kongers. So another way for autocrats to defend their power is to rally the regime supporters. And the rallying strategy is not only just about the calculation of the cost benefits of any type of activities, but it's more about the delegitimization of a particularly political institution. And so far, according to the literature, there are primarily three ways for autocrats to delegitimize a democratic trend. So the most commonly used technique of the autocrats is to use the nationalist rhetoric. And as previously Professor Tian Guangmeng have been talking about, that Chinese nationalism is built on this 100 years of accumulation by foreign forces. So by its origins, the involvement of any foreign forces is sort of like considered as sensitive and immoral to some extent to many Chinese people. And also we suggest that nationalist rhetoric is not the only tool that autocrats have to defend their position or defend the authoritarian regime, but it can also point out the, for example, the impact of those democratic movements on the socioeconomic performance. And we would see that this tendency will kind of like being enhanced, particularly when we consider authoritarian regime not just as a proactive defenders against any type of diffusion, but as a proactive players who seeks to kind of like construct a new type of legitimacy to persuade the many either like both domestic readers and also international readers to believe that there are alternatives to a Western style of democracy. And those kind of like persuasion, for example, like China's promotion of the Chinese model is built on the achievement in socioeconomic performance, and in turn to delegitimize democracy, it could kind of like point it out some like negative impact of those democratic movements on socioeconomic performance, including, for example, its impact on some daily economic activities and also its impact on social stability. And finally, we have to admit that there is a emotional aspect, like Professor Zhao mentioned, like pragmatically speaking, for the state, that the state can pragmatically incite the emotional reactions of individuals towards particularly events. So we would say that those emotions got intensified when citizens witnessing the expansion of their opposing force. So that happened, for example, like in the United States, when after the Black Lives Matter movements, like we saw a backlash of the conservative forces. And it can also apply to other political scenarios. For example, like when Chinese citizens see that there is an expansion of those pro-democratic forces, and especially for citizens who already had, who are already pretty skeptical about, you know, how well or how legitimate democratization would be, they will feel, they will kind of like the anxiety and anger spread among those domestic readers, and they could kind of like be more, became more cohesive and be rallied by around the national flag, because they feel like their positions as the supporters of the Chinese regime got threatened. So from there, we also developed our second set of the hypothesis that for autocrats in their management of the media, to actually delegitimize the democratic movements in Hong Kong and to actually enhance their support base, they could either blame the Western's black hands using nationalistic rhetoric, and they could actually criticize the protest disruption of social stability to actually show that the involvement of the Western black hands is not just detrimental to harm the national pride of the Chinese people, but also it could kind of like cause substantial damage to the society or make the people's life worse. And thirdly, it could kind of like describe the protest as threatening and going out of the control of the Hong Kong government, so that domestic readers actually feel the urgencies to take action and defend their homelands that is endangered by the Western style of pro-democracy trend. So we actually get our data from multiple sources. The first one is we collect the news articles about Hong Kong published by People's Daily from June 15th to January 2020. So before the outbreak of the coronavirus, because that was a lot of things got disrupted. And also similar, like in both in Beijing and Hong Kong. And we also examine the features of the protests and gatherings in Hong Kong based on these list of the events that is available on Wikipedia. Like it kind of like documents when and where those events actually took place, and also the news resource of how international media and Hong Kong media actually report the events. And we double check like whether all these events are covered by the Chinese media, or the Chinese media selectively talk about some of the events and drop the others. So the way we do that is we try to find those try to know whether those events are mentioned by the Chinese media by searching on the Baidu News engine. So it kind of like covers more than 500 news websites in mainland China. And to actually measure a news article, we actually examine whether a news article contains the listed 5 features. The first and second one examines whether this article served the purpose of demobilizing the potential opponents by describing the states as strong and repressive. So the first one is whether it actually highlights the efforts of the repression, and the second would be whether it describes the protesters as minorities or as a unpopular group of people. And the latter 3 indicators measured whether this article served the purpose of rallying the regime supporters by describing the state as a vulnerable homeland that needs protection. It could stress the scale and impacts of the protest by describing the protest as especially large scale and going out of control. It could kind of like focus on the violence of the protesters, or it could kind of like blame the West for intervening in Hong Kong issues. So we actually come up with a very detailed coding rules of how we actually label those news articles, and we try to make the coding rules as replicable as possible. But because of the time limits, I don't want to go too much details about how we actually code those articles, but we made it pretty clear in our paper. So the results, firstly, is to generally seeing the temporal distribution of the news articles we examined. And on the right-hand side, you see how many articles are published each day by the People's Daily that serve a particular theme, that serve the themes of demobilizing the opponents. And just by eyeballing the two figures, you can see that the articles talking about state as vulnerable Homeland outnumbered the articles talking about the state as a capable entity. So we will, and that's kind of like both true in terms of its overall pattern and also in terms of the temporal change. But we will explore those two the patterns more in detail. So to examine the overall pattern, we simply just look at the average articles that talk about different issues each day. So for example, we will say that on average from June 2019 to January 2020, that on average more than 2 articles talked about the violence of the protesters. And in comparison, less than talk about repression of the police force, and less than 1 articles actually talk about the unpopularity of the protesters. So to compare the means, roughly we would say that more articles, there are more articles that serve the rallying purposes instead of the demobilizing purposes. So what about the temporal change? We firstly cut the articles into just by the median date in our analysis. So we wanted to see like whether the articles published at a later half of the movement look different compared to the articles published in the former half of the movements. And the results are listed as below in figure 4. We can see that there is a significant decrease in terms of the articles talking about the repression and unpopularity of the protesters, and slightly increase of the articles of talking about Western's black hands. So those kind of like we see this decrease talking about the violence of the protesters. But in generally, the pattern would be still like at a later stage of the movements in Hong Kong. The state-run Chinese media put more efforts in shaping the movement as threatening, violent, and initiated by the Western or sponsored by the Western force, then focusing on their discussion about whether this movement is a marginalized and minor issue, and talking about the police force repression of the protesters. Figure 5 is kind of like a robustness check of whether this our observations still holds when we kind of use different ways of selecting the articles, and we basically cut the article, categorize articles into articles before the first quantile date and after the 4th quantile date, and still like the trend is pretty similar. So a decrease in articles talking about repression and unpopularity of the protesters, and more articles about state as vulnerable homelands threatened by Western forces and violent contesters at a later stage of the movement. So to summarize, we
argue that there are three ways to prevent the diffusion of the Hong Kong protest for the Chinese autocrats. So first is to completely ban the discussion using censorship to delete all the sensitive words and making the videos unavailable to the domestic readers and domestic netizens. And second is to actually attract netizens and domestic readers' attention on the state's capacity and to actually show, and in a way to deter the potential opponents. The third way would be to rally the citizens in support of their homelands by describing the threats that a state is facing. So our findings suggest that at least in the case of how Chinese parties they deal with the Hong Kong protest, the latter two strategies were adopted, and particularly the rallying strategy were used more frequently as the movement reached to its peak in the end of the 2019. And next, we actually move on to explore like whether the Chinese media's portrayal of the protest is consistent with what is really going on in Hong Kong back at that time. So we find a very interesting thing is like there was more detentions launched by the Hong Kong police force at the later half of the movement. However, stories about the repression of the police force got curtailed in a way.
You move a little bit faster.
Okay, got curtailed to serve the rallying logic. And also we using some statistical tools, this is not by any means a causal arguments, but to actually show that the interesting finding here is that so the interaction term actually shows that for protests which involve the police adoption of weapons and police detentions, their likelihood of being reported by the Chinese media declined as they approached to the end of the 2019. So this selection of the facts actually indicates that they were less emphasized on the demobilization part of the story, but sort of like more emphasizes on the rallying the citizens and regime supporters. So I can actually stop here if we're about to, where I'm reaching the time limits, but that's primarily what we have found, and open, and we welcome any suggestions, both from methodological and theoretical perspectives.
Okay, thank you for such a very interesting research. I really learned a lot. And now the discussant is Professor Molly Roberts from Poli-Sci Department at the University of California, San Diego, my alma mater. Hi, Professor Roberts.
Hi, thanks for having me. And I'm so glad that I had the opportunity to discuss Shiqi and Jessica's paper because I got the chance to read it, and it's just a really great one. So I feel really lucky. So this is, a really fascinating study. It, highlights the questions of when does a government shift censorship from a censorship strategy to a propaganda strategy. And I think above and beyond that, it's not just shifting from a censorship strategy to a propaganda strategy, but it's also the type of propaganda strategy. So this is not a propaganda strategy emphasizing repression versus one rallying opponents, rallying rallying around the flag. So I think I think the theory of this is really interesting, and one that will have big impact. I think with the theory section, I thought about sort of the factors that would be important to this shift. And there's sort of two main ones that I could come up with. One is how visible is the event? So if it's impossible to actually do the censorship strategy because the event is so big that it's really difficult to not get word of, then it sort of forces the propaganda strategy. And the second one was how much public opinion on the issue is sympathetic to the government's position already. And I think that that's another component, especially within this case, kind of makes it easy, or makes it maybe more strategic for a rally around the flag rather than emphasizing repression. Maybe emphasizing repression is sort of not the most strategic thing since public opinion is already moved in that direction. And on the first sort of part of that, one paper that I thought that you might find interesting, I don't know if you've seen it, is this paper by Rosanas and Stuckel about coverage of negative economic events in Russia by state media. And basically they find that the state media doesn't censor negative economic events. And I think partly because it's very difficult to hide negative economic events, but that they frame negative economic events in terms of foreign threat. And I think that's pretty consistent with some of the things we're seeing here, although the rallying part isn't part of that. But I thought that might be an interesting paper to sort of be in conversation with. The second paper that I thought was on the second point is Jidong Chen and Yiqing Xu's paper on like the strategy of censorship, and they argue that censorship can be bad sometimes because a no censorship case can show divisions about an issue, and that those divisions might then sort of deter the opposition because it kind of shows the amount that the issue is divisive. And I thought that really spoke a little bit to your work here, say, when there is maybe the public opinion is divided, maybe that's, a time where this rallying and exhibiting this division, right, might be useful. So I think that was another paper that I kind of thought spoke, not the same argument you're making, but maybe has something, is in conversation what you're doing here. So I thought that bringing those sort of components out, like when would you expect to see this versus when maybe you would not expect to see it as much, would be kind of an interesting way to link it to other cases. Although this case is incredibly important, and so I really like that you chose it. So shifting to, that was sort of my thoughts on the theory, shifting to the data a little bit, and I want to make sure to leave time for questions. So I thought this is just an incredible effort in terms of coding all of these newspaper articles into these 5 different categories, and also linking it to the data about the protests. I thought it would be helpful just from a paper perspective in the data section, just some description of like what the size of the data was, and like a table or something, and like, what newspapers the second data source was coming from. I thought that would be sort of interesting. And then in the coding section, it would just be helpful to have a table of the categories, because I got a little turned around sometimes, like which category does this go and which category does this go into? But that would just be kind of useful. Those are small, just like formatting question comments though. I thought, I thought that I know that you guys had mentioned in an email that maybe you were interested in sort of automating something like this in the future. And so I kind of thought about the data section a little bit, not for this paper, but just generally. I mean, it seems like you've done a lot of hand coding for this paper, and you kind of done, kind of an exhaustive list, but maybe for future work, this is an amazing hand coded data set. And I feel like what's underappreciated in automated text analysis is the importance of training data. And what you've basically done is created this amazing training data set. And so you could then use this in other newspaper articles, or also on social media, other things like that, to sort of identify these frames using supervised learning. I think that would be really cool, really interesting. And you could then, generalize this to other forms of media during the same time period. That would be pretty interesting. So that was one way. I don't think for this paper, because it seems like you really have a lot of data, first of all, and a lot of results already, but maybe for future papers. I was also sort of wondering on the data side of this is how much do you think this is a feedback loop? Like this took place over such a long period of time. How much do you think this was trying out different frames in the beginning and seeing how what the reaction was? And then at the end, as you see sort of like one frame become dominant, is this because, you know, this is working somehow for public opinion or other things? And I thought, you know, it's kind of hard to see this learning process, but I thought that would be an interesting thing to sort of try to, you know, was there also reaction to these articles, or what is the government measuring as success here from, and I think this maybe isn't this paper, but would be maybe an interesting thing to tease out down the road. How is the government defining success, and then shifting its strategy in reaction? And then the last sort of comment that I had was on the, you know, I think, or on the, this is more like an implication comment. You know, this reminds me a lot of, Jessica, your work on nationalist protests and sort of the danger of this as well. And so I wonder, like, how much is this a dangerous, just rally around the flag, how much is it a dangerous strategy of, you know, tying the hands of the government and then not being able to sort of have policy flexibility in the future? And, you know, or is this, like a, you know, a commitment or some sort of like audience cost strategy? Is, you know, I was interested in how this also ties the hands of the government strategy and going forward in the future. So I think, you know, having the other like data piece would be just like making a really nice code book that other people could use in the future for replicating, like, or using this in other case studies. I think that would be super big contribution, and you probably already have it. So that would be like a cool thing to put in the appendix. But otherwise, I thought, you know, this is a really careful analysis and important findings. And so thanks so much for letting me read it.
Thank you for such a wonderful comments on the very good paper. I learned a lot, as I said, from this paper. I don't have any problems with the research itself to divide into the media strategy into the demobilization and writing support. So for my question here is that looking at the whole Hong Kong, because I'm very interested now the development in Hong Kong itself, I'm wondering to what extent the current outcome basically controlled the government, the Chinese mainland government controlled the Hong Kong issue, is due to this propaganda media type of efforts. You talk demobilization and the writing support, all due to the coercive intervention, direct intervention by the government. In my mind, I think the direct intervention is more effective than the propaganda strategy. They use the legal instruments, try to impose the national security law, and also try to restructure the legislative organ. So this research itself is very interesting, very methodology, everything is very solid. So how you put this research in the bigger picture of Hong Kong, that's more interesting to me. I think also more interesting to the readers. And on another small aspect, we talk ready strategy here. The ready, the targets could be use of masses. It could be two parts. One is those on the mainland. We talk about the vulnerable homeland people. The other part is Hong Kong people. So really support to, I think that I will assume the results in both, in the two different places on mainland China and on Hong Kong will be very different. And so I don't know if you take that into your consideration of the using those data or reach your conclusion. So I really don't have much questions about the research. So let me open up for the comments from the audience. Anyone? You all have a same feeling as I do. It's a good paper. I really like it. I want to publish the right way. I really like it, especially the Hong Kong issue now is still very hot. Anyone?
Well, I do have a question.
Okay, he's our student.
Yeah. I'm just grad school student, so I don't know if I'm qualified to comment on someone's PhD thesis. But one question is that how real do we feel like the internet information is? Because I mean, using data to study a country or nation is a way to do it. I mean, I feel like there is nothing wrong about it, but still, like as someone who hang out online a lot. I mean, I do a lot of Weibo and a lot of Twittering as well. But it feels like online or on those online formats that the China that I perceive was pretty different from the China that in practice or in my personal experience that I encounter. For example, like if we just imagine the income level of China, that on Weibo you see a lot of like people flex on their wealth and on their fortune, which is pretty common in many countries. But at the same time, how real if we collect data on that part, especially to try to understand what's happening or what's going on in China, then how real the picture that we get is. So that is just my question, or something that I would say that we should concern about.
Good. I'm glad our MA student, not PhD student, could ask question for. Anyone else? If not, because time is very late, so let's go back to the authors. Any responses? It's good paper, for sure. I really enjoyed it.
Yeah, thank you so much for the comments. I'll start with the feedbacks, and Jessica, you can talk about things that I didn't mention. So first about Professor Roberts' comments on discussions about how I think it's, I appreciate the idea that we should kind of like add a paragraph talking about the switch from this censorship strategy to the more like a propaganda strategy, because I feel like current paper, we directly talk about this, like we noticed that Chinese parties are adopting a new set of strategy, but we didn't really talk so much about the changes. But I guess for readers, they are wondering like why, kind of like whether there are kind of like a background discussion about for example, the limitations of the friction strategy or the limitation of the censorship. And I think it kind of like will be better for us to actually pave the way to talk about propaganda and talk about our attraction strategy. And also, so for illustration issues, I think it's kind of like easy for us to adjust it a little bit. And in terms of, let me see. So in terms of the feedback loop, I'm wondering like whether, so maybe there are some ways to actually examine, for example, Chinese netizens' reaction to this type of strategy. For example, like we can actually check like when this hashtag of "we also support the Hong Kong police" became popular, kind of like became, for example, the top 10, like what day it was on the Weibo, and like whether like after that day, that is sort of like this type of rallying strategies became more frequently adopted by the state-run media. So maybe that's a way that I can think of so far to actually examine the feedback. Yeah, because I was thinking about like maybe there was kind of like a learning process for the Chinese Party state to adjust their strategies. And about the potential danger of that, well, so far I don't have any answer. Maybe Jessica, Professor Weiss is in a more appropriate position in answering that question. And about Professor Zhao's comments, I think primarily our study is to actually examine the impact of this movement on domestic, like Chinese mainlanders. So like, because for example, previously we see that after occurrence of Arab Spring, like we had this term like the Jasmine Revolution in China. So we're like, the main focus is to explore like whether, like how the Chinese Party state prevent the citizens from becoming more skeptical about their legitimacy of the authoritarian regime after occurrence of the Hong Kong protests. So, but the outcome of the Hong Kong, I think, is also a very important question, and in particularly, I guess we can talk about it in our discussion about implication of our study, because, well, I noticed that for those protesters in Hong Kong, they had been seeking to build some alliances with mainland students, but kind of like their efforts was not that successful, and it could kind of like, it could be related to a lot of like for example, like the media's portrayal of this movement. But of course, like it's not to rule out the kind of like the Chinese direct intervention in a lot of Hong Kong, in the Hong Kong issues, but kind of like this type of, it's more like this strategy firstly impacts Chinese mainlanders, and kind of like Chinese mainlanders' reaction is related to a lot of like strategies of the Hong Kong protesters, kind of like impacting how many people actually support this protest or in favor of this protest, particularly in mainland China. So about a question from Qi, how real the information is. I think this paper is primarily to examine the intention of the party state or the intention of the state-run media. So it kind of like leaves this very important question about how Chinese readers perceive those type of informations to the future research. So it's not really the focus of this paper, but our goal is to actually see that, at least from the perspective of examining the Chinese party state's intention, like we see the state has put more efforts into a new type of propaganda or a new type of management of the media. But how efficacy it is, well, we see that the cyber state became more active in promoting a lot of like nationalist arguments, but we don't systematically examine the efficacy of those type of propaganda and censorship in this paper. Yeah, and that's it. And Jessica, do you want to add anything?
Sure, I'll just add briefly. First, thanks so much to Molly for taking the time to provide really such excellent comments, and also to Suisheng for your kind words about the paper. I think it will really help us to situate this strategy within the larger context of what was taking place. Really, as Shruti just said, I think our focus has really been on how to persuade the domestic audience not to support this sort of cross-border mobilization. But of course, even that propaganda strategy was only one of many tools. There were people detained, people's phones looked at crossing the border. And I think both of you have really, I think, nicely pointed out the importance of thinking about how does this domestic propaganda strategy play internationally as well as in Hong Kong? And so there is, if I don't know that I think about it as tying the government's hands, but it is certainly projecting a certain kind of image that is very, it's very nationalistic, it's very pugilistic. It's, there's sort of much more of the be feared than loved. And I think we see this on display with the, Xinjiang cotton, like boycott H&M, like it's the same, it's a very similar kind of, unleash the nationalism to instill fear abroad, which, is very, it's not risky from the perspective of domestic stability, right? I think that it's their priority placed on domestic stability is coming at the expense of sort of international trust or any kind of reassurance. So it is, I think, alienating those, so requiring, I think, Suisheng, the Chinese government to rely on these more direct methods, so the intervention, et cetera, to coerce and repress abroad as opposed to rely on attraction and persuasion. I really appreciate the other comments, Molly, of the different papers to be in conversation with. Those look terrific, and look forward to diving in and seeing how we can draw those linkages as well. And finally, just really appreciate the point on, in this day and age where there's so much excitement around big data, that there's still value to this kind of hand coding, which, is like a little pilot, but to hear that it has value as a standalone piece is really appreciated and gratifying as a stepping stone potentially, but unto itself as well. So thank you.
Okay, thank you. And I want to thank all the paper presenters, discussants, and all the participants. Today's conference is very late, and we'll end here. And for the publications of these papers, I will talk to the guest editor separately. Okay, thank you all, and have a good evening. Bye-bye. Good evening here in the US. For those in China, it's morning. Bye.
Bye.